The grief journey continues. I am Christy Bundukumara, psychiatric nurse practitioner, but unfortunately, I'm an expert in grief. I have lost 3 children over the course of 17 years, and I am in the process of learning how to grieve and teaching others how to grieve. Today, I'm going to be talking about controlled grief, and I have other videos on controlled grief. But as I go through my grief journey, it evolves. It evolves in being able to better explain what it is. So if you've been following me on my journey, I went into 45 days of grief. And I consciously said, between the anniversary of my son's death and the anniversary of my daughter's death, I am going to do controlled grief every single day. And so I'm going to continue this grief journey explaining what happened in those 45 days, what evolved, what I learned. So in the very beginning, I knew I was going into this period of controlled grief. And I have been talking about controlled grief since 2016 when my son Reggie passed away. And on a regular basis, I did what I'm calling controlled grief in order to feel the pain of grief so that it doesn't completely impact every other area of my life. And in this process, I've had several of my counselors at the clinic, as well as people that I'm talking to, kind of ask me, what is the definition of controlled grief? Is controlled grief its own theory of grief? And I didn't really have a solid answer on what is the definition of controlled grief. And this is kind of one of my pet peeves in mental health in particular, is that there is no clear black and white, this is a definition, this is what will happen, this is how you get over loss and grief. Anyone who has lost a child or had any other kind of intense grief knows that it is not that simple. And I talk about in several other videos when I'm going over grief theories, how it sounds so like just do these steps and you will get through grief. And I think that is true for the normal grief process. But when something happens that is outside of normal grief process, we will all have loss. We will all lose a pet. We will all lose a grandmother or, even your mother at some point. But when it's out of order, when it's tragic, when it comes so unexpected, like your children or a spouse or someone you are spending a lot of your time with and have, a future planned with, this will cause what I'm calling intense grief. And we will need to take the time to do what I call controlled grief. So what is it not? It is not a cure for grief. It is not easy. And I talked about it's not black and white. The process will be different for everyone. This process started for me in 2016 because I had an adopted son die in 2005 in a drowning accident, and I went into fight or flight mode because shortly after that, my son was diagnosed with DRPLA and was having catastrophic seizures. And I was raising 6 children. So a lot was going on, and I was actually just trying to take care of myself. I didn't grieve that death properly. In 2016, my son Reggie passed away from complications of DRPLA. And I started talking about what is controlled grief. And I would take the time and I would sit with pictures and I would cry and I would allow the pain and the intensity of that pain to kind of be released from my body from taking that designated time for what I call controlled grief. When my daughter died in her sleep with no warning, yes, she had seizures, and yes, she had DRPLA, but she was not sick. There was no indication that she was going to pass. I thought I had at least 10 more years, 10 more good years with her. And she died in her sleep. And the shock of that, I tried to do the controlled grief the same as I did with Reggie, but I was hitting a wall. And so the controlled grief, and what I call controlled grief, has expanded in its definition to not only taking that time to grieve and feeling that pain, but taking control of the process. So I went into this 45 days knowing I was going to be doing what I call controlled grief, but I also reviewed many grief theories and learned from others and read books and started this whole process, because intense grief is more than just an emotional reaction. It's more than just pain. We are physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual beings. And when something like that happens to us, it just disrupts everything that we know and believe. And so the process of controlled grief incorporates all of those pieces of ourselves. And in the end, towards the end of the 45 days, I came up with the 5 selves, which I talk about in the other video. Self-care. Right there in the beginning of my 45 days, it hit me like a ton of bricks that I had not been caring for myself for 15 years. So part of this controlled grief process is not just the grief. It's all of who we are has been disrupted. And so that self-care, self-regulation I talk about, self-improvement. When I say self-improvement, I'm talking about learning from others. As I was going through that 45 days, I was researching other grief theories. And, I discussed them in other videos, but it was also for my self-improvement. Finding your spiritual self and finding movement for yourself, because this pain needs to be moved out of the body. So controlled grief is this encompassing process that will likely be a lifetime for intense grief. But I challenge you to get started, to push through. That's what I learned in the very beginning. So I'm going to go through all of the lessons that I learned over this 45 days. But the first lesson that I learned is that controlled grief is more than just that time that you take to grieve. It's taking control of the process and taking control of your life and your 5 selves. So I challenge you on this journey. Keep going. Don't give up. I believe that you are mentally strong.